What's up, everyone? Hope everybody's having a great day out there. Today, we need to talk about something that's been weighing heavy on my mind, and probably yours too if you've been following the Greg Biffle tragedy. And I want to focus on one specific aspect that might explain everything about those final moments. Why were the gear and flaps still down? Kenny Wallace brought up something that really caught my attention, and the more I dig into this, the more it makes sense. The extra drag from that configuration might have been the difference between making that runway and what ultimately happened. And folks, this isn't about blame. This is about understanding, because there are lessons here that could save lives. So let's start with what we know for certain. The Biffle family citation took off from runway 10 at Statesville, and about 10 minutes later, they were trying to get back to runway 28. Weather was marginal that day, with ceilings around 1,200 feet, broken visibility near 5 miles with drizzle. Not great, but technically VFR. The aircraft impacted about 1,800 feet short of the runway. Now, here's where things get interesting and where Kenny's observation becomes crucial. Multiple aviation experts have been analyzing this, and they keep coming back to one thing. That citation, with gear down and full flaps, simply could not maintain altitude, especially at what appears to have been near maximum weight capacity. Let me explain what that means in real terms, because this is critical to understanding what happened. When you lower the landing gear on a citation, it creates massive drag. We're talking about a significant increase in what pilots call parasitic drag. Add full flaps to that equation, and you've basically turned your sleek jet into a flying barn door. Now, normally, that's exactly what you want when you're coming in to land. You want that drag to help you slow down and descend. But here's the thing, and this is where everything starts to make sense in a tragic way. If you configure too early, if you commit to that landing configuration before you're absolutely certain you can make the runway, you've just eliminated most of your options. Dan Grider, who holds the single pilot exemption for this exact type of citation, made a point that really stuck with me. He called the citation an underpowered pig and said that with a single engine, it would not perform like the big planes that Dennis Dutton was used to flying at Delta. And even with both engines running, once you're in that dirty configuration with gear and flaps extended at maximum weight, your performance margins shrink dramatically. The manual actually specifies that this plane can't maintain altitude with landing gear down and full flaps, especially at max weight capacity. Think about that for a second. The book literally tells you this configuration won't work for sustained flight. So why would experienced pilots find themselves in this situation? This is where we need to talk about what I call configuration trap. It's not an official term, but it describes something very real that happens in cockpits during high-stress situations. When something goes wrong shortly after takeoff, your instinct is to get back on the ground as quickly as possible. That instinct is natural, it's human, and most of the time it's the right call. But jets aren't like smaller planes. In a Cessna 172, you can pretty much configure whenever you want and still have options. In a jet, once you commit to a configuration, you're committed to the energy state that comes with it. The data shows something really interesting here. The aircraft initially climbed normally after takeoff, reaching about 2,000 feet. Then something changed. The altitude stabilized and the airspeed started to decay, indicating a thrust reduction. Now, some have speculated this was due to a baggage door opening, which would make sense. You'd want to slow down to prevent further damage. But here's where the configuration decision becomes critical. At some point, the gear came down. At some point, the flaps were extended. And based on what we're seeing in the flight path, that configuration happened while they were still trying to figure out their approach path. Let me paint you a picture of what this means in practical terms. You're at maybe 1,500 to 2,000 feet. You've got marginal weather with clouds just above you. You've got some kind of issue that's demanding your attention, whether it's an engine problem, a baggage door, or something else. You're trying to get back to the airport. Now, in that moment, extending gear and flaps might feel like preparation. It might feel like you're getting ahead of the situation. But what you're actually doing is trading energy for drag. And in a jet, that trade is expensive. Once that gear is down, you're burning energy at a rate that would shock most piston pilots. Here's something else to consider, and this comes from looking at multiple citation accidents over the years. The normal procedure when you have an abnormal situation right after takeoff is not to immediately configure for landing. The trained response is to climb to 3,000 to 4,000 feet, clean up the aircraft, engage the autopilot, and then assess your situation. This gives you time, it gives you altitude, which is energy in the bank, it gives you options. But that's not what happened here. The flight path suggests they never really climbed above 2,000 feet and may have been trying to stay below the clouds for visual reference. Now, I want to be really clear about something because this is important. Making decisions under stress is incredibly difficult. When you're in that cockpit and something's not right, every instinct is screaming at you to get back on the ground. The airport is right there, you can probably see it, and extending the gear feels like progress. It feels like you're solving the problem. But in a jet configuration, timing is everything. Configure too early, and you've just signed up for a commitment you might not be able to keep. Configure too late, and you might overshoot or have to go around, which burns more fuel and time. The radio transmissions that have surfaced, and there's still questions about their authenticity, but if they're real, they paint a picture of a crew that was task-saturated. The voice, reportedly Jack Dutton, sounds calm, but the words tell a different story. Quote, "We're getting everything going. We're getting our gear down." End quote. That's not normal radio phraseology. You don't announce gear extension on the radio. That suggests someone who's overwhelmed, trying to manage multiple tasks, and maybe trying to reassure themselves as much as anyone listening. Let's talk about energy management for a minute, because this is the heart of what we're discussing. Every aircraft has what we call an energy budget. That budget is made up of altitude, which is potential energy, and airspeed, which is kinetic energy. You can trade one for the other. Need to climb? Trade airspeed for altitude. Need to accelerate? Trade altitude for airspeed. But here's the critical part. Drag is constantly stealing from your energy budget. The more drag you have, the faster you're spending that energy. And when you're in a citation with gear down and full flaps at maximum weight, your energy expenditure rate is enormous. The preliminary data suggests that after the initial climb and turn, the aircraft descended from about 2,000 feet to around 1,500 feet while also slowing down. That's a double energy loss. They're giving up both altitude and airspeed. Then there appears to be an attempt to climb again, with the aircraft gaining about 350 feet over 20 seconds. That's roughly 1,000 feet per minute climb rate, which matches single-engine climb capability for a citation. But here's the thing. If they were in landing configuration during that climb, they were fighting massive drag the entire time. Every foot of altitude gained was expensive in terms of engine performance and fuel burn. This brings us to something called the region of reversed command. It's a flight regime where you need more power to fly slower. Sounds counterintuitive, right? But when you're slow with high drag, you can get behind the power curve. You need more thrust just to maintain altitude, and even more to climb. If you're already at high power settings, maybe because you've lost an engine or you're at maximum weight, there's no reserve left. You're operating at the edge of the envelope with no margin for error. The witness accounts are particularly telling here. There was apparently an Aztec that took off right after the Biffle plane. That aircraft also circled back, and interestingly, landed on runway 10 while the citation was still on the ground after impacting short of runway 28. Think about what that tells us. Another aircraft took off in the same conditions and successfully returned. The difference? The Aztec is a piston twin, different performance characteristics, different energy management requirements, and critically, different configuration requirements. A piston twin doesn't lose as much performance with gear down as a jet does. Now let's address the elephant in the room, the crew composition. Dennis Dutton was a retired Delta captain with thousands of hours, but here's something important from the analysis. He was used to flying big jets, really big jets, the kind where losing an engine still leaves you with plenty of power, and where the procedures are different. In a big jet, you've got more altitude to work with typically. You've got more powerful engines relative to the weight. You've got different energy margins. The citation, especially a legacy citation like this one, is a different animal entirely. It's what some pilots call a pocket rocket. Quick and efficient when everything's working, but unforgiving when margins get thin. The question of who was actually flying becomes relevant here. If Dennis was in the left seat as pilot in command, he may have been applying big jet thinking to a small jet problem. If Greg Biffle was flying from the right seat, he had the multi-engine rating, but may not have had the citation-specific experience to recognize how quickly the energy situation was deteriorating. And if reports are accurate that Jack Dutton was making the radio calls from the right seat, then we have a situation where someone without multi-engine certification was in a position where they couldn't provide meaningful assistance during a critical phase of flight. Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough: configuration discipline. In airline operations, this is drilled into pilots from day one of type rating training. You don't configure until you're stable. You don't extend gear until you're on a stabilized approach path. You don't go to full flaps until you're certain of making the runway. These aren't suggestions. They're hard rules backed up by decades of accident analysis. But in Part 91 operations, the kind of flying this was, there's more flexibility. That flexibility can be a good thing, but it can also lead to situations where configuration happens based on feeling rather than procedure. The weather adds another layer to this. With ceilings at 1,200 feet and visibility at 5 miles in drizzle, you're dealing with marginal VFR conditions. The temptation would be to stay below the clouds to maintain visual contact with the ground. But staying low means you can't build up that energy reserve. You can't climb to a safe altitude where you have time to think and plan. You're stuck in what some pilots call the coffin corner, not the aerodynamic one, but a situational one, where all your options are compromised. Let me share something about decision-making under stress that I think is relevant here. When humans are under pressure, we tend to fall back on what psychologists call recognition-primed decision-making. We see a situation that looks familiar, and we apply a solution that's worked before. For a Delta captain used to big jets, the familiar solution might be configure early and get established on approach. For a private pilot, the familiar solution might be to keep the airport in sight at all costs. Neither of these solutions is necessarily wrong, but in a small jet with degraded performance, they might both be suboptimal. The track data shows multiple heading changes during the return attempt. First, they appear to be setting up for one runway, then they change to another approach. Each time the plan changes while you're in landing configuration, you're bleeding energy you can't afford to lose. You're dragging those barn doors through the sky, burning fuel and altitude with every turn. And if you're already task saturated dealing with whatever caused you to return in the first place, these configuration changes become anchor, dragging you down literally and figuratively. There's a concept in aviation called stabilized approach criteria. By certain altitudes, you need to be configured stable and on path, or you go around. Period. No exceptions. In airline operations, this is typically 500 feet in visual conditions and 1,000 feet in instrument conditions. But here's the thing about Part 91 operations. Those criteria are recommendations, not requirements. You can legally attempt an approach that would be mandatory go-around in commercial operations. That flexibility sounds good until you realize it means there's no hard floor, no automatic trigger that says, this isn't working, we need to reset. The final moments of the flight path are heartbreaking when you understand what was likely happening. The aircraft is low, slow, and in landing configuration, trying to make runway 28. They're probably visual with the runway. They can see safety right there in front of them, but the physics won't cooperate. With gear down, full flaps at maximum weight, and potentially dealing with degraded engine performance, they simply don't have the energy to close that final gap. The engines might be at maximum power, but it's not enough to overcome the drag. They're quite literally falling out of the sky in slow motion. This is where Kenny Wallace's observation becomes so profound. That extra drag from the extended gear and flaps wasn't just a minor factor. It was likely the determining factor. Had they kept the aircraft clean, meaning gear up and flaps retracted until they were certain of making the runway, they would have had more options. They could have climbed higher. They could have extended their pattern. They could have had the energy reserves to deal with whatever complication caused them to return in the first place. But once committed to that configuration with margins already thin, the outcome became increasingly inevitable. What makes this even more tragic is that Charlotte Douglas Airport was only 32 miles away. With a clean aircraft and a climb to altitude, they could have declared an emergency and been vectored for an approach to a much longer runway with full emergency services standing by. The professional ATC handling would have reduced workload. The ILS approach would have eliminated visual reference problems. The longer runway would have provided margin for error. But all of that requires a decision to not immediately return to the departure airport. It requires fighting that instinct to land right now and instead choosing the option that provides the most margin. There's a phrase in aviation that old pilots use. Don't just do something, sit there. It sounds backwards, but it captures something important. Sometimes the best immediate action is to not take immediate action, to climb, clean up, and think, to build energy reserves before you spend them, to make decisions based on procedure rather than instinct. But that's incredibly hard to do when alarms might be going off, when you might have an engine problem or a door open, when every fiber of your being is saying, get this thing on the ground now. I want to be really clear about something as we wrap this up. This is not about assigning blame. These were experienced pilots dealing with a serious situation under difficult conditions. They were doing their best with the information and training they had. But there are lessons here. Hard lessons about energy management in jets, about configuration discipline, about the importance of procedures, especially when things go wrong, and about how a series of decisions that each seem reasonable in isolation can combine to create an impossible situation. The Citation flew for approximately 10 minutes from takeoff to impact. In those 10 minutes, dozens of decisions were made. When to reduce thrust, when to turn back, which runway to choose, when to extend gear, when to add flaps, how low to descend. Each decision narrowed the options for the next one. And once the gear was down with full flaps in that energy-depleted state, the window for recovery had essentially closed. They were committed to making that runway with whatever energy they had left. And tragically, it wasn't enough. So when we ask why the gear and flaps were still down, the answer isn't simple. It's a combination of human factors, training, experience, and the brutal physics of powered flight. It's about how stress affects decision-making. It's about how procedures developed over decades of commercial aviation don't always transfer to Part 91 operations. And it's about how, in aviation, small margins can have enormous consequences. The gear and flaps were down because at some point it seemed like the right decision. But in a Citation, at maximum weight, with potential performance issues and marginal weather, that configuration became a trap from which there was no escape. This accident will be studied for years. The NTSB will produce their report with findings and recommendations. But for those of us in the aviation community, the lessons are already emerging. Configuration discipline matters. energy management is critical. And sometimes the hardest thing to do is to resist the urge to configure early, to resist the pull of the nearby runway, and instead climb cleanup and give yourself the gift of time and altitude. Because in aviation, as in life, the decisions we make when margins are thin define the outcomes we have to live with. Or, in tragic cases like this, the outcomes we don't. Thank you all for watching and for being part of this discussion. Please share your thoughts below, especially if you have experience with citations or similar situations. And remember, every time we analyze these accidents, we're not just talking about the past. We're trying to prevent the future. Stay safe out there, everybody, and we'll see you at the checkered flag.